Harrington Gallery on East 73rd Street had been built to make people feel small in all the right ways. Vaulted ceilings of pale limestone, chandeliers that dripped like frozen rain, or so polished they caught the faces of everyone walking across them and gave back a version slightly softer, slightly more beautiful than the truth. It was the kind of place that rewarded confidence and punished hesitation, and so its guests moved through it with the particular ease of people who had long since stopped questioning whether they belonged. Claire Harrington moved through it like she had built it, which, in a way, she had. 38 years old. Chief Executive Officer of Harrington Ventures, a private equity firm that had quietly swallowed 4 mid-size healthcare companies in the last 2 years and digested them without a flinch. 5 feet 9 in heels, which she always wore, dark hair cut to the jaw in a line so precise it looked architectural. Dressed tonight in deep charcoal silk, no jewelry except a single thin bracelet of white gold on her left wrist, a gift she'd bought herself after closing her first $100 million deal, because no one else had thought to. She was surrounded by people. She always was. Claire, Margaret Forsyth, silver-haired and immaculate, chair of the hospital foundation. The endowment announcement was extraordinary. Really, we're so grateful. The work deserved the support, Claire said, and smiled, and meant it in the precise, calibrated way she meant most things fully and without warmth. She moved on. She was good at moving on. Across the room, near the windows that overlooked the garden, her daughter sat in a chair that had been placed there by Claire's assistant, Renee, because Renee understood that the daughter needed a defined space, a corner, a perimeter, something that said this is yours, and no one will come here unless you want them to. The chair was upholstered in pale blue. The girl sat very straight, hands folded in her lap, eyes fixed on a point somewhere above the middle distance. Her name was Iris. She was 7 years old. She had not spoken a word in 3 years. The doctors called it selective mutism, with features of sensory processing disorder. The first specialist had used more words. The second had used different ones. The third, a woman who had charged $400 an hour and worn orthopedic shoes, had sat across from Iris for 40 minutes, and at the end said, "Carefully. She's observing. She takes everything in. She simply doesn't give it back." Claire had driven home from that appointment and sat in the parking garage of her building for 11 minutes before going upstairs. She had not cried. She had not known, quite, what to do with the feeling that had no name. That had been 18 months ago. Since then, 2 additional therapists, a music therapist, a play therapist, a neurodevelopmental pediatrician in Boston whose waiting list was 8 months long, an iPad app designed to give Iris a voice through symbols and pictures, a nanny. Margaret, not the foundation chair. A different Margaret, who had a degree in special education and spoke to Iris in a soft, deliberate way that Iris ignored with perfect composure. And there was this, the galas. Claire brought her to them because the alternative was leaving her home with Margaret, the nanny in the apartment, and something in Claire, not guilt exactly, something older and less articulate, could not allow that, could not be in a room full of people while her daughter was somewhere else alone. So Iris came and sat and watched the middle distance. "She seems calm tonight," said Renee, appearing at Claire's elbow with a glass of sparkling water. "She's always calm," Claire said. Renee didn't answer. She'd been Claire's assistant for 4 years and had learned the geography of Claire's silences, which ones were dismissive, which ones were tired, which ones were something else entirely. This one was something else. Claire looked across the room at her daughter, at the pale blue chair, at the small, straight-backed girl who sat inside her own world like a figure inside a snow globe, visible, contained, unreachable. "She observes," the doctor had said. "She simply doesn't give it back." The evening moved around them both. Waiters with trays, laughter in clusters, the string quartet in the corner playing something that had been composed by someone dead for 200 years and still managed to sound alive. Claire accepted congratulations and made small, precise jokes and wrote a check in her head for the pediatric wing that would be announced next month. And the whole time she watched her daughter, the way you watch something you love and cannot reach with a focus that looks, from the outside, almost like not watching at all. His name was Daniel Whitfield. and he had been working the service entrance of the Harrington Gallery since 6 o'clock that evening. 34 years old, 6 feet, though he stood in a way that didn't advertise its shoulders slightly forward, head level. The posture of a man who had learned to take up exactly the space he needed, and no more. The uniform was black trousers and a white shirt, and a name badge that read Staff Event Services. And he wore it the same way he wore everything. Without irony. Without apology. He'd been contracted through the catering company. He did this 3 or 4 times a month when the event work was available. Weddings, corporate dinners, gallery openings. His regular work was maintenance, a contract with 2 office buildings in Midtown that paid steadily if not generously. Between the two, he kept the apartment. He kept his son. His son's name was Owen. Owen was 5. Owen's mother, Natalie, had died 2 years ago. Ovarian cancer, fast and ferocious, diagnosed in November and finished by the following March. Owen had been 3. He had cried for her for 6 weeks and then, as children do, had grown around the absence the way a tree grows around a fence post, not ignoring it, not defeating it, simply incorporating it into the shape of who he was becoming. Daniel had not grown around it yet. He was still learning the shape of the space, but Owen was all right. Owen laughed at his own jokes and collected rocks, and had recently become very serious about the subject of volcanoes. He went to kindergarten at the public school 4 blocks from their apartment, and his teacher, Miss Delgado, said he was kind to the other children, which Daniel considered the most important information he had ever received about his son. He kept a photograph in his wallet, the kind of thing that seemed old-fashioned, a photograph in a wallet. But he'd never gotten around to changing the habit. And now he was glad he hadn't. Owen at 4, sitting in a patch of sunlight on their fire escape, holding a piece of quartz he'd found in the playground, with the reverential grip of an archaeologist who has discovered something ancient and irreplaceable. His face tipped slightly sideways, the way he tilted his head when he was thinking hard. The photograph was soft at the corners from handling. Daniel had learned, in these 2 years, that grief did not make you less present. It made you more attentive. You stopped taking for granted the particular weight of a child in your arms, the specific pitch of that child's laugh, the way a small person could walk into a room and rearrange everything in it simply by being there. Loss had burned away his tolerance for the performative, the social gestures, the half-present conversations, the way people talked at each other rather than with each other. He had become, without intending to, a man who paid close attention. It was not always comfortable. Close attention sees things. It sees things people would rather not be seen seeing. He carried trays. He refilled glasses. He moved through the event with practiced efficiency. And when the work was automatic enough, he watched the way he always did, the habit of a man who had learned that observation was the cheapest and most reliable form of knowledge. He saw the CEO first. Hard not to. She moved through the room with an authority that wasn't aggressive exactly but was absolute, the authority of someone who had stopped wondering, years ago, whether she was in the right place. He saw the daughter second, the pale blue chair, the small girl, the stillness of her. Daniel had known stillness like that. Owen, in the weeks after Natalie died, had gone very quiet in a way that wasn't like his usual quiet. It was the quiet of someone listening very hard for something that had stopped making sound. He'd tried, in those weeks, everything: more conversation, more activity, more structure. He tried reading more books and watching more films and going to the park more often, and all of it had been well-intentioned, and none of it had been the thing Owen needed. The thing Owen needed was for Daniel to stop trying so hard. When Daniel had finally, out of exhaustion more than wisdom, simply sat on the floor beside his son and said nothing, just sat there, breathing, present without agenda, Owen had climbed into his lap. Not immediately, 20 minutes later, but he'd come. He'd learned not to fill silence, not to talk at it or explain it or offer things to replace it, just to be near it, to let the silence know it was not alone. He watched the girl across the room for a long moment, a tray balanced in one hand, and then went back to work. Margaret the nanny arrived at the pale blue chair at 8:15 with a small plate of fruit and a determined smile. "Iris, sweetheart, are you hungry?" Iris looked at the fruit. She did not look at Margaret. "There's strawberries. You like strawberries?" "Nothing, Iris." Margaret set the plate carefully on the small table beside the chair. "Dr. Lena said we should practice asking for things we want. Remember? Can you point to something you'd like?" Iris looked back at the middle distance. Margaret exhaled very quietly, the exhale of someone who was professionally trained not to exhale in this way, but was human enough to do it anyway. She sat down in the chair beside Iris and tried a different approach. Silence. Which was Dr. Lena's second recommendation. "Wait. Give space. Don't rush." She waited 4 minutes. Iris did not move. "Okay," Margaret said softly. "I'm right here if you need me." She stood and took the fruit plate with her, because leaving it felt somehow like abandonment, and went to find a corner where she could watch Iris from a distance, while reviewing the conference materials for the sensory processing workshop she was attending next week. The string quartet finished something and began something else, a slow movement, stately and a little melancholy. One of those pieces that sounds like it's trying to remember something just out of reach. Two of the gala guests, a man named Stuart Ames and his wife, Patricia, old friends of the Harrington family and veteran observers of its complications, glanced toward the pale blue chair as they crossed the room. "Poor little thing," Patricia murmured, and then immediately corrected herself. "I don't mean it like that. She's just so different," Stuart said, supplying the word she'd been reaching for and not quite wanting. "She's perfectly fine," Patricia said, which was not what she meant at all, and they both knew it, and they walked on toward the champagne with the slightly guilty relief of people who have noticed something difficult and successfully moved away from it. This was the common experience of Iris Harrington at public events, a kind of ambient sympathy that expressed itself primarily as avoidance. People felt for the child. They were not sure what to do with the feeling, so they positioned it at a comfortable distance, from which it could remain a feeling without becoming a responsibility. The event's event coordinator, a brisk woman named Holly, who wore an earpiece and carried a tablet, paused near the chair twice in the first hour, and each time decided against stopping. She was not unkind. She simply had 17 other things requiring attention. And the girl in the chair was not, technically, requiring attention. She was very quiet. In event management terms, a very quiet child is, if not a success, at least not a crisis. On the other side of the room, the CEO was standing with a man in a very expensive suit, and they were laughing together in the way of people who do not particularly like each other, but have practiced liking each other for so long that the practice has become indistinguishable from the real thing. Claire's eyes moved to her daughter every 45 seconds. Daniel, refilling water glasses at a nearby table, clocked the interval without meaning to. He had the attention span of someone who had spent 2 years watching a small child for signs of distress, and the skill had generalized. He noticed things. He noticed when the interval between a parent's glances shortened, and he noticed when it stayed precise, like a timer. Claire Harrington's was a timer. 45 seconds. 45 seconds. You could set your watch. He noticed something else, too. He noticed that each time she looked at her daughter, her face did the same thing. A contraction, very small, around the eyes. Not pain exactly, closer to the expression of someone pressing gently on a bruise to determine whether it still hurts. Testing and finding the answer unchanged. The girl in the pale blue chair had not moved in 20 minutes. She was not distressed. She was not bored. She was not anything that required intervention. She was simply somewhere else, inside herself, attending to something the rest of the room couldn't see or hear. If you looked at her long enough, you stopped seeing a child who was failing to engage and started seeing a child who was engaged with something invisible, something internal and ongoing, and to her, apparently sufficient. Daniel had seen that quality of attention before. Owen had it sometimes, before sleep, when he was working through something in his mind that he hadn't yet found words for. It was not absence. It was the opposite of absence. It was a very full presence, directed somewhere unavailable to outside observers. He set down the water pitcher and picked up a cloth and began to wipe down a section of the service table, which put him 12 feet from where Iris sat. He did not approach her. He did not look at her directly. He simply occupied the same region of the room and went about his work. And after a few minutes, Iris, without any change in her posture, without any visible adjustment, shifted her focus from the middle distance to him. He didn't acknowledge it. He just kept working, but he was aware of it. The way you are aware of the sun moving across a room, not watching it directly, but tracking the changing quality of the light. He dropped something. It wasn't dramatic, a small serving spoon, slipping from his hand and ringing against the marble floor with a bright, clear sound. He picked it up. He glanced at it. He set it on the table. Iris was watching him. He crouched to check that nothing else had fallen, and while he was down there, near the floor, he did something he was not entirely conscious of doing. He pressed the flat of one hand against the cold marble and tapped it twice. Lightly, like a knock, but gentler. He wasn't sure why. It was something he did with Owen sometimes, at the end of long days, when Owen was tired and language felt like too much for both of them. A knock on the floor. "I'm here. You're here. That's enough." He stood back up and went back to work. Iris had leaned forward almost imperceptibly in the pale blue chair. Daniel didn't see it. Or perhaps he did and gave no sign of seeing it. Which amounts to the same thing in a language that depends on pressure being very low. The quartet moved through a slow movement. Guests moved in patterns of greeting and parting. Claire Harrington, across the room, accepted a glass of champagne she would not drink, and watched her daughter over the rim of it, without seeming to watch at all. Margaret, the nanny, from her corner, observed that Iris was perhaps slightly more upright than usual, and made a note in the small notebook she carried for observations, which she would transcribe later into the shared document she maintained with Dr. Lena. And Daniel Whitfield continued working, and did not try to be anything other than what he was. A man doing his job in the same room as a child who had, for reasons she could not have articulated and would not have tried to, decided to pay attention to him. That was all. For now, that was everything. It was 9 o'clock when he came back to that section of the room. He wasn't assigned to it particularly. He was moving between stations, and the route happened to bring him past the pale blue chair. And so he was there again, not approaching, not intruding, simply present in the geography. Iris was still in the chair. She had not touched the fruit plate, which someone had returned to the small table beside her. She was watching him from the moment he entered the area. With an attention that was different from her usual focused elsewhere gaze, this was directed, aimed, purposeful. He set down a tray on the service table. He did not look at her. He began rearranging some of the items on the table with the thoughtful, unhurried movements of someone who has time and is not in a hurry to use it. After perhaps a minute, he crouched down again. There was a napkin on the floor, or the appearance of one, or perhaps just a reason to be low, and pressed his hand flat against the marble again. Tap, tap. He stayed there a moment. From the pale blue chair, without any announcement, without any preparation, Iris slid forward to the edge of her seat and placed one small foot on the floor. Just one foot. Her white patent leather shoe against the pale marble. She did not stand. She did not approach. She simply moved that one foot from the rung of the chair to the floor and left it there, and looked at him. Daniel looked at the floor. He did not look at her. He did not smile, or widen his eyes, or make any of the encouraging sounds that adults make when a child does something they've been hoping for, the sounds that communicate. I noticed, I'm pleased, now do it again, because those sounds, however well-intentioned, are a form of pressure, and pressure was precisely what this moment could not afford. He simply acknowledged the floor. As if the floor were the interesting thing, he stood up. He went back to the tray. Iris pulled her foot back onto the chair rung, but she watched him go. The thing about miracles is that they almost never look like what you expect. They don't arrive with music, or with light, or with the sense that something large and significant is occurring. They arrive the way a change in weather arrives, a shift in the air, a new quality of silence. And then you notice that something is different, and you can't quite say when it became so. At 9:20, Daniel Whitfield was crouching near the service table for the third time. The cloth required folding, or appeared to, or perhaps he had simply found a reason to be low and near and available, and his hand was flat on the marble floor. And this time he didn't tap. He just left it there, open, palm up, not beckoning, not requesting, just, here is a hand. It is not asking for anything. Iris Harrington got out of the pale blue chair. She walked across 6 feet of marble floor in her white patent leather shoes, and she stood 2 feet from Daniel Whitfield, and she looked at his open hand on the floor, and then she looked at him, and then she looked at the hand again. He did not move. She crouched down. She was 7 years old and small for 7, and crouching brought her nearly level with the hand. She studied it with the thoroughness of a scientist examining a specimen, the lines of the palm, the calluses on the fingers, the short, clean nails. Then she put her hand on top of his, just that. Her small hand, very lightly, on his. The quartet was playing. The guests were moving. The chandeliers were doing their crystalline work overhead, and in a 6-foot radius around the pale blue chair, time had stopped in a way that only 2 people knew about. Daniel kept very still. Iris kept her hand there for 4 seconds, long enough to be intentional, short enough to maintain sovereignty, and then she sat back on her heels, and she looked at his face, and she said, in a voice that was barely above a breath, barely enough to reach his ears from 2 feet away, again, one word that had been nowhere and was now here, in the air between them, solid and warm and impossible. Daniel looked at her. His face did not break open into celebration. He controlled it the way you control something. You don't want to ruin with your reaction, but something moved through him that had no name except, perhaps, the particular gratitude of being trusted. He tapped the floor twice. Tap, tap. Iris put her hand on his again. Again, she said. Clearer this time. The voice of someone trying out a tool they'd forgotten they owned. He tapped again. She put her hand down again, and then she did something he did not expect. She tapped, with her other hand, on the floor beside his. 2 taps, learning the rhythm, making it hers. He tapped back. She tapped back. A conversation, without a single word more. Claire Harrington had been standing 40 feet away, half listening to something about a merger in the Pacific Northwest, when her peripheral vision registered movement at the pale blue chair. Her daughter was not in it. The jolt was instant and visceral, not panic exactly. The panic came a half-second later, her eyes moving fast across the room, scanning the nearest clusters of guests, the doorway, there, near the service table, on the floor. Her daughter was on the floor, crouching, next to a man in a white staff shirt who was also crouching. And they were tapping the floor together, in turns, like a call and response. And her daughter's face was, Claire had not seen her daughter's face do that in 3 years. It was open. All the way open. The careful blankness was gone. The vigilant distance was gone. And what was there instead was interest. Engagement. The specific brightness of a child who is present, fully present, in the body she inhabits. Claire walked across the room without being aware of walking. She was aware of the champagne glass in her hand, and then she was not aware of it, because somewhere between there and here she had set it on a passing tray without looking. She was aware of people in her path, and then not aware of them because they moved, because something in her trajectory communicated that she was going somewhere and intended to arrive. She stopped 6 feet away. Her daughter did not notice her. Her daughter was entirely absorbed in the tapping, in the back and forth, in the conversation conducted in percussion on cold marble. She was smiling, a small smile, private, directed at the floor and the hand beside hers, and her lips were moving, and Claire heard it, and her body went completely still. Again, the word was barely sound. It was the ghost of a word, the shape of a word passing through a small throat that had forgotten or refused the act of shaping words, and now remembered, here, in this of all places, with this of all people, and Claire heard it, and the room stopped making sense. Say it again. She didn't know she'd said it aloud until the words were out. Her voice was wrong, too rough, too stripped of the calibration she always maintained. The man looked up. Her daughter looked up. For a moment, the three of them were in a triangle, crouched and standing, none of them entirely sure of the geometry. Iris looked at her mother. She looked back at the man. She looked at the floor. She tapped it. Twice. Again, she said, looking at the floor. Then she looked at her mother. Again, Mama. Claire Harrington, CEO of Harrington Ventures, architect of 4 acquisitions and a charitable endowment, and a life constructed with such precision that there was no room in it for anything unplanned, went down on her knees on the marble floor of her own gallery. Not gracefully, not carefully, she simply descended, as if the bones had stopped insisting on their usual function, and she was on the floor, and her charcoal silk dress was on the floor, and she was at eye level with her daughter, and her daughter was looking at her with those clear, watchful, fathomless eyes. Say it again, Claire whispered. Please. Iris considered her. The way she considered everything thoroughly. Without hurry. Mama, she said. The word was a stone, dropped into still water. The ripples went outward in every direction. And the room heard them not because anyone was paying attention to the far corner near the service table, but because the particular frequency of a mother hearing her child's voice, for the first time in 3 years, has a quality that the human nervous system recognizes without being asked. Conversations dropped a register. Heads turned, then looked away, then turned back. Margaret the nanny had a hand over her mouth. Renee had a hand over her mouth. The man in the white staff shirt was looking at the floor. And something in his posture said that the floor was a very interesting object, deserving of his full attention, and he was giving it that attention, and he was not participating in the moment that had nothing to do with him, and everything to do with what his presence had made possible. Claire put her arms around her daughter. Iris let herself be held, not stiffly, softly. The way a person lets themselves be held by someone they have decided, in this moment, to trust. She found him at the service entrance at 10:15, when the event was winding down and the catering crew was breaking things into boxes, and the string quartet was packing their instruments with the methodical tenderness of musicians who've done this 1,000 times. He was carrying a folded tablecloth. He stopped when he saw her. "I wanted to thank you," Claire said. He nodded. Not in the way of someone deflecting, but in the way of someone who is listening to what isn't being said yet. What you did with her. How you... She stopped. The sentence didn't have an end that made sense. How you reached her. How you unlocked her. How you did in 40 minutes what every specialist in the city couldn't do in 18 months. None of those were right. She spoke, Claire said. She hasn't spoken in 3 years. I heard, he said. How did you know? What to do? He shifted the tablecloth to his other arm. He thought about it genuinely. She could see him thinking, not performing thought but actually working through how to say something true. I didn't know, he said. I have a son. He's 5. When his mother died, he went quiet for a while. Not the same, I'm not saying it's the same, but I learned that quiet isn't always a problem. Sometimes it's a person listening very hard. Claire was quiet. She wasn't broken, he said. She didn't need anything fixed. She just needed someone to be near her, without needing her to be different. He said it simply. The way you say something you've figured out slowly over a long time and have finished being surprised by. Claire looked at him. He was 34 years old and tired in the particular way of single parents who work 2 jobs, and there was nothing exceptional about him except the extraordinary ordinariness of a person who had learned, through loss, how to be fully present with someone else's pain without trying to cure it. What's your name? She said. Daniel. Daniel Whitfield. I'm Claire. I know, he said. It was her gallery. Of course he knew. Your son, she said. What's he like? Something shifted in his face. Not a smile exactly, but the thing that happens just before one. He's very serious about volcanoes, he said. And he tells his own jokes and laughs at them before the punchline. That sounds like a good person to know. He's the best person I know, Daniel said, without any self-consciousness. The way you say true things when you've stopped worrying about how they sound. Claire was quiet for a moment. The sounds of the event breakdown moved around them, clinking glass, folded linens, the low conversations of tired workers. She's been to 9 specialists, Claire said. 9. And they all said she was observing, taking everything in, that she understood everything but simply chose not to give it back. She paused. I kept wondering what I'd done wrong, what was missing, what I needed to provide. Providing's not always the thing, Daniel said. No, Claire said. I'm starting to understand that. He nodded. He shifted the tablecloth again. He had more work to do. She could see it, the practical weight of the remaining hours of his shift. The drive home, the early morning. Thank you, she said again, for not trying. He looked at her. For not trying? To help, to fix, to intervene. You were there, and you let that be enough. He thought about that. It's not a strategy, he said. I'm not sure I could teach it. It's just the way you learn to be. When you can't afford to make things worse. That landed in Claire in a way that she would think about for a long time, the specificity of it, the honesty of it. The accidental illumination it cast back onto her own approach to her daughter, to her life, to the careful architecture of provision and management she'd built, in place of the simpler, harder thing. Good night, she said. Good night, Miss Harrington. She started back toward the gallery. Then she stopped. Claire, she said, without turning. Good night, Claire, he said. The apartment was quiet when they got home. Margaret the nanny had gone, her shift was over, and Claire had sent her a message from the car, and it was just the two of them in the apartment, which was large and high and filled with the particular silence of expensive spaces, the kind of silence that costs money to maintain. Triple-pane windows, thick walls, the hush of a building whose architect understood that what the very wealthy truly purchase, beyond all other amenities, is insulation from the noise of a city that will not quiet itself for anyone. Claire had grown up in that kind of silence. She had rebuilt it, precisely, as an adult. She had not, until tonight, questioned whether it was the right kind. Iris was not asleep. She was never easy to get to sleep after an event. Too much sensory information to process, too much to file away and consider. She sat in the bath with her rubber duck collection arranged along the edge, 11 ducks, each one a specific color, each one placed in an order that Claire had never been able to fully decode, but that Iris maintained with absolute fidelity, and moved them through the water with the systematic logic she brought to all her private investigations. Claire sat on the edge of the tub and watched her. This was not unusual. She often sat here. It had been, in fact, one of the constants of the last 3 years, this bath, this observation, the sense of presence without connection that had become so familiar. Claire had almost stopped noticing it as a specific kind of pain. It had become instead a feature of the landscape. A topographical fact, the distance between them, measured not in feet but in some unit for which no instrument had yet been built. But tonight was different. Tonight she was sitting on the edge of the tub, not because it was what she did, but because she was noticing, for the first time in a long time, what the sitting actually meant, what it had always meant, what it had failed to be. She thought about what Daniel Whitfield had said. She wasn't broken. She didn't need anything fixed. She thought about what that implied about the person who had spent 18 months trying to fix her. She thought about the 9 specialists, each with their frameworks and their waiting rooms, and their laminated charts of emotional faces. She thought about the iPad app with the symbols. Iris had used it exactly 3 times, and the music therapist who came on Tuesday afternoons, and the play therapist who wore soft shoes and sat on the floor of her own office, surrounded by sand trays and puppets, and the way Claire had carefully constructed Iris's life as a sequence of interventions, each one thoughtful, each one evidence-based, each one selected by a mother who was doing everything she knew how to do and could not understand why it wasn't working. She had never once simply sat on the floor. She had sat on the edge, always the edge, the observer's position, the position that maintains a remove. She had provided, she had arranged, She had hired expertise and scheduled appointments and managed the logistics of her daughter's development, the way she managed everything else with precision and competence, and the deep, unacknowledged assumption that competence was a form of love, that doing more was the same as being more, that the quality of her effort could substitute for the particular thing her effort was not. She's observing, the doctor had said. She simply doesn't give it back, but she'd given it back tonight, to a man who hadn't asked for it, to a man who had done nothing except be close and be still and leave his hand open. Claire looked at her own hands on the edge of the tub. They were capable hands. She knew this. They had signed documents that moved hundreds of millions of dollars. They had gripped steering wheels and handshakes and the edges of tables in boardrooms when she needed to appear more certain than she felt. They were not hands accustomed to being still and open and low to the ground. She set her right hand on the edge of the tub, not reaching toward Iris. Not extended, not requesting. Just there. On the cool porcelain surface. Iris looked at it. She moved one of her rubber ducks, the yellow one, the one missing an eye, the one she'd had since she was 2, and that Claire had replaced 3 times with identical ducks, until she'd realized that Iris could tell the difference, and wanted the specific scarred original, and placed it carefully against Claire's fingers. Claire did not react. She kept her hand still. Iris moved the duck back and forth against her fingers, studying the interaction of rubber and skin and water. A study. A data-gathering exercise. The brow slightly furrowed in the way that meant Iris was processing something. Holding it up to the light of her attention, determining its properties. "Ducky," Iris said. Her voice in the tiled bathroom was clear and immediate, stripped of the cavernous acoustics of the gallery. No high ceilings or crowd murmur to absorb and soften it. Just a word, small and exact, in a tiled room at 11 o'clock at night. Claire breathed once before she answered. Very carefully. "Ducky," she said. Iris looked at her. Then, at the duck. Then she began to move the duck in a slow, purposeful circle through the water. And she made a low sound that might have been a song, or might have been a navigation system for the duck's ocean voyage. And Claire sat on the edge of the tub, and did not cry, and did not celebrate, and did not reach for her phone to text Renee or Dr. Lena or anyone. Because this moment was not for sharing yet. It was just for being inside of. It required no witness except themselves. She thought, I have been so busy managing her life that I forgot to be in it. She thought, he sat on the floor. She thought, I never sat on the floor. The bath went on. Iris moved her ducks through their arrangements, with the seriousness of a small general marshalling forces across a field only she could see. And once, somewhere in the middle of it, she looked up at Claire and said, "Bubble," and pointed at the small container of bubble bath on the shelf. Claire poured in the bubble bath. She worked up a lather with her hand. She blew a slow stream of air across her palm, and the bubbles lifted and drifted pink gold in the bathroom light, catching it, refracting it, tumbling across the air between them and Iris, 7 years old and grave as a judge, watched them with her whole self. Again, Iris said. Claire blew again. She sat on the edge of the tub for another 40 minutes that night. Iris talked 4 more times blew, duck, more. Stop each word offered into the steam and the quiet of the room as simply as breathing, as if words had always been available and she had simply been waiting for the temperature to be right. Claire answered each one. Simply. Without celebration, without the brightness she could feel pressing against the inside of her chest. The brightness she kept contained because she understood now, for the first time, that containing it was the right thing, that the moment she made her own feeling the subject of the room, Iris would feel the pressure of it. And pressure was the thing that had always, always, driven her back into her distance. So she kept it in. She breathed it back. She answered each word with a word, and let the silence between words be what it was. Not a problem, not a failure, not a symptom, just silence, doing its work. The way silence does when it is allowed to. When Iris was out of the bath and dry and in her pajamas, and settled into her bed with the specific arrangement of stuffed animals that constituted her border and perimeter and nighttime geography, Claire sat beside her and opened the book they had been reading for the last 3 weeks. A story about a bear who lived in a library and read aloud in the measured, unhurried way she'd always read to Iris, even in the years when Iris gave no sign of attending. She had always believed Iris was listening. She had not, she realized now, believed it quite enough to change how she spent the rest of the time. Iris fell asleep before the bear reached chapter 3. Her breathing slowed and deepened, and her face in sleep had the total absence of strategy that faces in sleep always have: open, undefended, the architecture of the person she was when no one was asking anything of her. Claire sat beside her for a long time after. She called Renee at 7 the next morning. "Cancel Thursday's session with Dr. Lena," she said. A pause. Both of them? The evaluation at 11 and the family session at 3. Another pause. Renee was very good at pauses that communicated carefully calibrated degrees of concern. This one said, "I will not push back, but I am registering that this is unusual. I'll reschedule?" Renee said. "No," Claire said, "not yet. I want to think about what we're doing, what the shape of it should be." She looked out the window at the early light on the park. "We may be fixing the wrong things." "Okay," Renee said, in the tone of someone filing information for later. "And I'm working from home today." Silence. A longer one. This one said, "You have not worked from home on a weekday in 4 years. I'll forward your calls," Renee said. "Thank you." She hung up and went to the kitchen, where Iris was already at the table, having been brought there by the night nanny at 7 with a bowl of oatmeal that she had not yet eaten, and a picture book she was studying with the focused energy of a scholar examining a primary source. Claire sat down across from her, not at the head of the table, across from her, at the same level, on the side where you sit when you are eating with someone rather than presiding over the meal. She poured herself coffee. She looked at the picture book, upside down. It appeared to be about trains. She said nothing. Iris ate a spoonful of oatmeal, then another. She turned a page. The morning moved slowly into itself. Outside, the city was doing its usual thing: trucks and birds and the distant arithmetic of traffic. In the apartment, the silence was different from the silence of the last 3 years. It was not the silence of a problem waiting to be solved. It was the silence of 2 people occupying the same space, both of them simply present in it. Iris turned another page. "Train," she said. To the book, not to Claire. But in Claire's proximity, in the air they shared. "Train," Claire said. Iris looked up. Her eyes gray, like Claire's. With the same quality of careful attention moved over her mother's face. "Red train," Iris said. "It is red," Claire agreed. Iris turned the page. "A yellow train." She looked at Claire. "Yellow," Claire said. Something in Iris's expression shifted, not quite a smile, but the approach to one, the landscape of her face rearranging itself in preparation for something warmer than its usual configuration. She pointed at the page. "Train," she said. "Yellow train," Claire said. Iris pointed at Claire. A long pause. "Mama," Iris said. "Yes," Claire said. "Mama." She kept her voice steady. She kept her hands still on the table. She looked at her daughter, and her daughter looked back at her, and the morning light came through the windows and touched everything evenly. The bowl of oatmeal and the picture book and the 2 faces across from each other, one small and new, one older and learning to be new again. She found his number through the catering company. It took 2 calls and some mildly artless explaining to the coordinator, who eventually gave it up without asking too many questions. She'd half expected to feel embarrassed making those calls a woman of her position, tracking down a catering staff member through an agency, but she didn't. She had spent too much of her life calibrating how things looked. This was something different. This was just what needed doing. She did not call. She texted. Because calling felt like too much of a claim on his time, and texting gave him the option of when to answer or whether. "This is Claire Harrington. I wanted you to know that Iris has been talking. 3 words yesterday, 6 today. Her therapist says to continue what we're doing, which turns out to be very little, which is apparently the point. Thank you." She put the phone down. She went back to the report she was reading. 15 minutes later, the phone buzzed. "That's really good to hear." Owen says hi. He doesn't know who you are, but he says hi to everyone. She read that twice. Then she wrote, "Tell him I said hi back, and that I recently learned something important from someone who didn't try to teach it. I hope he has a good day at school." The reply took longer this time. Long enough that she'd returned to the report before it arrived. "He's going through a meteor phase now. If your daughter ever wants to know anything about space rocks, he's available for consultation." She looked at the message. She thought about Iris, who in the last 48 hours had said 17 distinct words. All of them nouns. All of them the names of things she was looking at or touching. All of them offered freely into the air between herself and her mother, without demand for response. And who had last night, before sleep, tapped the surface of her bedside table twice, and looked at Claire, and Claire had tapped the table twice back, and Iris had closed her eyes, and smiled in the particular private way she had a smile, that was not for performing, that had no audience. That was simply the outward expression of a small person finding the world, in that moment, acceptable. Claire had sat on the edge of the bed for another 20 minutes after Iris fell asleep, not moving, not planning the next day or reviewing the report she had left open on her laptop in the kitchen, just sitting with the darkness and the sound of her daughter breathing, and the knowledge that something had changed, not fixed, not resolved, not completed, but changed. Shifted on its axis, tilted toward something that might be called, if you use the word carefully, hope. She wrote, "We may take him up on that." She put the phone down again. On the other side of the apartment, she could hear Iris, a sound so ordinary and so extraordinary that Claire had to stop and let it exist fully before she could return to work. Not a word, just the sound of a child moving through her own space, arranging her things, living in the volume of the world, present, fully, finally, impossibly present. The way people are when they've been found, not because someone came looking with a map and a plan and a methodology, but because someone sat down beside them on the floor and tapped and left their hand open and waited to see if that would be enough. It was enough. It is always, eventually, enough.